arkadaşlar başlıyoruz.
So why should an entertainer
Hi everyone, welcome to MMA EMEA webinar series. There's no new normal. My name is Elvin Altun Apple'ın and I'm the MMA EMEA Business Development Director. And I'm really happy to be facilitating this webinar with you, with the AdColony team. So before we kick off for our session, I want to give a very brief information about the MMA for those that may not know much about us. So MMA is the Global Industry Association for Marketing, and we operate in 4 regions globally. And our primary audience is marketeers and marketing ecosystem. And our goal is to enable the innovation of marketing and shape the future of marketing with mobile. And here are some of the member companies. We have almost 1,000 companies. So we have brands, agencies, networks, technology providers. So that's just a bit about us. And for our members, we provide education modules, webinars like this, events, research materials, tools, networking possibilities, both digitally and physically, hopefully one day. So in a nutshell, this is us. And if you would like to learn more about the MMA and what we do, you can always reach us through our website, LinkedIn, or you can simply email me at elvin.altun@mmaglobal.com. So that was a brief introduction about us. Today, I'd like to pass it over to Warrick, who's our MENA board member and EMEA board member at the same time. And he represents AdColony in a few different places in the MMA, at the MMA. He's also leading our research committee at the MENA region. And today, with his teammates, he'll be giving us some insights about the new iOS 14 and what we need to know as marketeers. So they're gonna make it an insightful session for us. So I would like to pass it to Warrick, please. Hi, Warrick.
Thanks, Alvin. Hi, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I know it's a little bit late in some of the markets, but I think this is going to be a valuable and insightful session, so it should be well worth your time. I think before we kick off, we've got Alex, Alasdair, and Jonathan on the line with us from our US team. So before we fire into the topic at hand, maybe I can hand over to each of you just for a quick introduction. Start with you, Alex.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here. My name is Alex Ritchie. I'm the product manager of privacy and big data at AdColony. So I've really been spending the past 3 or 4 months kind of getting, elbow deep in, all of the big changes that we're making to plan for iOS 14 and IDFA deprecation. So glad to be here.
And over to you, Alasdair.
Hi, my name is Alasdair. I am Director of Product Strategy for AdColony, and my job is mainly to figure out what our product roadmap looks like over the next few years, and I also product manage the AdColony DSP. So my other job is to figure out how we respond to all those bid requests that people send us.
Guys, I think let's jump into the topic at hand. So as Alvin mentioned, today we're discussing the upcoming changes in iOS 14, notably those pertaining to user privacy and the IDFA, or Apple's identifier for advertisers. And probably dig into how this is going to impact developers, publishers, and advertisers. So Alasdair and Alex, the IDFA is on death row. Despite the last minute stay of execution that was passed a couple of weeks ago, all signs are pointing to the fact that this IDFA is going to be deprecated in early 2021. So while it won't completely be gone, it's going to be 100% opt-in with big scary warnings to users. So obviously, a lot has been happening in the engineering and app development and growth world. But given the carnage of 2021 that it's already served up, this may still be flying a little bit under the radar for some brands and agencies. So Alex, why don't you take the time to catch us up on Apple's plans and what they're putting in place and how this, might top line have an impact on everybody?
So to kind of get the conversation going around what do we need to do, it's probably helpful to start with what's happened, right? So this whole conversation kind of came around at Apple's WWDC 2020, Worldwide Developer Conference. And during that conference, they announced kind of 3 big changes that will be coming along with iOS 14, now 2021, to kind of deal with the growing issue of user privacy in the in-app space. And really, they kind of announced 3 big changes with the release of iOS 14. So the first one, which most folks are probably aware of by now, is that to get access to the IDFA ID, the ID for advertisers, publishers will need to trigger a kind of publisher-specific modal asking for explicit consent for the user to be able to track them through Apple's, app tracking transparency framework. Ultimately, the opt-in rates for that and what that will be is a little bit unclear. But what is clear is that brands and apps that have better relationships with their consumers are probably going to be having better opt-in rates. So ultimately, in the industry, I don't think anybody who really had their ear to the ground was surprised that these changes had happened. If anything, some folks, the surprise for some folks was that Apple didn't deprecate the IDFA altogether, which was expected. Instead, what they've done is they've kind of added a period of grace, so to speak, to allow marketers and advertisers and publishers transition into a world where we're going to see fewer and fewer IDFAs. So that's the first big change. The second big change is that they announced that publishers are going to be required to have what they've essentially likened as a privacy nutrition label. So this isn't crazy different than what's already existed with requirements around apps needing to have a privacy policy. But essentially what this does is it allows users when they're downloading an app to see, what all is going on inside that app, what data is being collected, who is it being sent to, all in the interest of transparency for the end consumer. And then the third change is Apple kind of announcing a new version of their SK ad network measurement solution. So with the oncoming deprecation of IDFAs, or rather partial deprecation of IDFAs, Apple kind of decided to hand out an olive branch to the in-app world, which is very dependent on those IDFAs for measurement. More specifically, attribution for in-app advertising and performance advertising, as we call it. So what Apple said is, well, we know that you need this IDFA to perform measurement. Now that we're taking that away, what we're going to do is we're going to provide you the measurement. They're essentially providing advertisers and marketers a sort of last click, last touch attribution to understand, without an IDFA, how did, XYZ marketing campaign actually drive those installs. Now, naturally, it being a privacy safe solution, there are a number of restrictions that come along with that, but I'm sure we can cover the rest of those things in the following 30-40 minutes. Anything you'd want to add on to that, Alasdair?
No, you pretty much covered it. The one thing I want to highlight is Apple has made it so that the user is going to give a choice on whether or not they want to be tracked across apps and websites. So essentially, if you're trying to do mobile measurement, there are essentially 2 options for an advertiser. There are use an IDFA if it's available, or there is use Apple's SK ad network solution. From Apple's documentation, what it appears is that if you attempt to track a user across an app or website outside of those 2 methods, it probably is not going to be permissible by Apple. So it's an interesting conundrum for advertisers because they're going to have to make major changes to how they currently do measurement for a large portion of their user base where an IDFA may no longer be available.
Okay, and Tom, how solid has Apple's communication been about these changes to date?
To be honest, it hasn't been solid 100% of the time. A lot of advertisers, a lot of providers and publishers were seeking clarification from Apple the first few months. And then what's happened is the solutions have been proposed in the industry, and we've seen some solutions kind of been withdrawn or kind of readjusted based on some clarification from Apple that's come further down the road. One of the big examples that come to mind is treatment of single sign-on and whether or not single sign-on solutions require any sort of opt-in. And Apple's recently clarified that yes, if you're using single sign-on and any sort of alternative ID as a way of tracking, then that also requires tracking using the ATT framework that Alex described. That was not made clear beforehand, so there were some solutions out there that were being developed where single sign-on was used in place of an IDFA and kind of circumvented the Apple app tracking transparency framework. So that now that that's been clarified, now that we have more information, I think it's going to be a little more clear, what solutions are going to exist out there.
Perfect, man. Alex, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that, kind of echoing a little bit what Alasdair said, that, to be honest, it was a little bit opaque starting on. To give you just kind of an example there, one of the constellations that Apple had provided, as I had mentioned, is this SK ad network measurement. But it really wasn't until just a couple weeks ago that folks and advertisers were actually able to get a running version of the new V2 SK ad network measurement up and going. And the documentation had been pretty opaque around when these sorts of things were going to be coming around. The one other note that I would add, and some of the recent clarification that Apple has provided, and kind of a new FAQ that they released, in addition to that single sign-on, is just kind of the clarification that it doesn't seem like Apple really wants to play ball here. They're pretty serious about the changes that are coming along, and I think they've also made it ultimately pretty clear that if you're the owner of an app, you're responsible for what goes on in that app. So I think it's a pretty clear sign to the marketers and the publishers out there that own the apps, is like, hey, you need to be aware what's going on with these partners that you work with, and you need to make sure that you're being above board about those sorts of things. So it's pretty clear that Apple is signaling to the market, we're serious about privacy, and everyone needs to get on board.
What are the direct impacts for marketers or mobile marketing as we know it? I'm specifically thinking about retargeting, mobile DSPs, fingerprinting, etc. Is it still going to make sense to offer an audience network in iOS 14?
Maybe it's good to start with what an IDFA does. So an IDFA is essentially a serial number that's associated with your device. And so anywhere you go, this IDFA goes with you. And this is the mechanism that advertisers have used for tracking users across apps and websites for some time. So for example, when you complete a transaction through an app, advertisers record some information on what that IDFA has done, and then we record more and more information over time so that we can gain an understanding of what that user's preferences are. And that IDFA is then used for behavioral targeting. So when an advertiser receives a bid request, we receive this IDFA, and then we have all this other information that we can use to associate this device with these user preferences and other things, so that we can do things like demographic targeting, but then we can also use this IDFA for things like frequency capping or suppression lists. So, for example, let's say I only want to show a specific device 3 of my advertisements, and then I consider that user has been saturated. That's something you need an IDFA for. And so without an IDFA, those things become either much more challenging or in some cases impossible to do. In the example of frequency capping, it's going to be very difficult to say, hey, I only want to show this specific user 3 of my ads because I won't be able to track this user across apps and websites without an IDFA. If the user opts in, you'll be able to do that. If they do not opt in, then you'll be able to use a different identifier called an IDFV, which essentially allows you to track that user within a single app or website. So there's going to be a few limitations based around that when you don't have an opt-in. So to kind of summarize things that are going to be impacted in no particular order, frequency capping or daily capping, suppression lists, demographic targeting or audience targeting are the key things that are going to be impacted, but also mobile measurement, as we discussed already, will also be impacted. And that's a specific case where, at least when we're talking about app-to-app mobile measurement, you need to have an opt-in on both the publisher app and the advertiser app in order to do mobile measurement. If we're talking about measuring the performance of a campaign or whether or not a specific user clicked on that campaign, that will also require an IDFA. But it will only require an IDFA on one side, on the publisher side, if it's not an app-to-app campaign. If it's an app-to-app campaign, you need to be able to have the opt-in on both sides.
Alex, anything to add to that? Otherwise, I want to start thinking about consumers here. How's this going to impact them?
Yeah, I might just add in a few more notes. So the nice thing about how Apple has decided to roll this out is that, IDFAs will still be present, right? So all of the techniques that marketers and advertisers have around, retargeting, around suppression, around frequency capping are still going to be there. They're just going to be less effective. So in this kind of new world where IDFAs aren't going to be ubiquitous or nearly so saturated, it puts it up to the marketer and the partners they're working with to kind of figure out what other tools do we have on the tool belt. And I think, in this period of kind of great turbulence, advertisers that are able to target effectively in terms of contextual signals will be the ones that are successful, right? Because we're kind of getting access to a new inventory. And it's a new inventory without, permanent IDs, so to speak, or substantially lasting IDs. So advertisers that are able to effectively make use of the information that exists without that, targeting based on app demographics, targeting based on, portfolio of specific inventory that you think resonates very well with the type of, users that you're going after. The advertisers that can make use of those sorts of things will probably be the most successful in this kind of new world that Apple's creating here. So I would say, it's the biggest question that advertisers are going to need to answer is, facing these changes, what other tools do we have in our tool belt besides the ones that we've been relying on so far to be able to drive efficient and profitable advertising spend?
So is this good news for consumers? Do they realize what's coming? Is it going to be positive? What's the ultimate impact going to be on user experience when we look at potentially ads becoming slightly less relevant? What do you think the impact's going to be?
So Apple's a hardware company to its core, and they deliver their hardware with software integrated into it in a seamless way. But essentially what Apple's determined is that their consumers, their customers who buy their hardware value privacy. And the more Apple cares about privacy, the more consumers will buy Apple devices which contain Apple operating systems and have the Apple App Store on there. So that's Apple's calculus. And then there's a kind of a high-level strategic element to this too, which is that Google also has a big mobile platform, but their core business is advertising. And so there's an argument to be made that Apple is one, aligning with consumer values, but also doing it in a way that's fundamentally good for their business. And so there's a strong justification for both the consumer and Apple for doing this.
Yeah, ultimately, I would say that the industry has been looking for a way now through many different organizations, the IAB being one of them, to figure out how to generate more transparency and more consent-based mechanisms for advertising. And what Apple has done here is they've just kind of forced everyone's hand, right? So ultimately, I think for consumers that value privacy, this could be a very positive change. At the same time, with less relevant ads and less targeted ads, I think most end users will find, that their ads are less relevant to them, and in the end, they might be exposed to more ads than before. So ultimately, I would say it's really kind of independent to what every end user prefers about their user experience.
Yeah, I think it ultimately is good for the consumer because the consumer is being given the choice to determine if they want to be tracked in a very transparent way.
Look, it's obviously a pretty broad set of changes globally. Are there things that marketers should think about now, to make sure that their strategy is sound when Apple flips the switch? I think what we've seen and heard rumblings, there's a lot of ad tech companies that are talking about a lot of short-term solutions. But how do you avoid chasing a moving target and instead, stay ahead of it?
So you mentioned it before, and you brought up a very good point that Apple's documentation hasn't always been 100% clear on what marketers should do, and that's been challenging for marketers when they've been trying to build hybrid solutions or solutions to transition into SKAd network. It's been very difficult to kind of hit that moving target, so to speak. One thing that Apple has done is they have delayed enforcement, and I think that the need for clarification from Apple is one of the driving forces behind that. So the world that we exist in today is a world in which iOS 14 is out, and the SKAd network measurement system that Apple wants advertisers to use when there isn't an IDFA is now available. But an IDFA is also still available, and Apple is also not enforcing the Apple App Tracking Transparency Framework yet. This presents a unique opportunity, but a small window of opportunity for advertisers to test what their campaigns will look like under SKAd network. And as Alex mentioned, there are some pretty significant limitations in what SKAd network allows advertisers to do. So when designing your campaigns for SKAd network, you must be very careful to make sure that your BI systems are equipped to handle it. 2, your campaign setup and structure is equipped to handle it. And 3, your mobile measurement partner is set up to handle it. And thankfully, now that Apple has given us 3 months to test this in a live environment, it is significantly easier to get those things in place.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a part of your question that I really liked that I want to focus on for a little bit. It's how do you avoid chasing a moving target and instead stay ahead of it? So there have been any number of talks, industry roundtables, many meetings for advertisers and marketers to try to figure out how exactly it is that we're going to adopt that. And if you've been listening to those conversations, you'll notice that there's been kind of almost, I don't want to use the word unhealthy, but quite a lot of discussion around, how do I bridge the gap, or how do I find a way to get around this? And I think ultimately that kind of misses the mark here. If you are reading through Apple's terms of service and trying to find a way that you can, secretly track someone while not being against the letter of their law, but going against the spirit of it, I think ultimately that's a mistake. And I think the players that are going to be successful are the players that are thinking, how can you fuel long-term sustainable growth with what Apple has in mind? So, I think there are a few things to talk about. One, in terms of short-term solutions, there have been some players out there that have been, how can I probabilistically match, or how can I fingerprint? And what Apple has come forward and said is, well, that's not permissible. That's not going to be allowed. And in a way, I think Apple has, a lot of authority here, in that they hold a very big stick over everyone's head, which is that if you're not playing by their rules, they can simply, take your app down from the App Store. They can reject your app from the approval process to get it up and live. So, I think the conversations that you want to be having with your partners is not how do we get around this, but how do we build sustainable growth on top of it? And there are a few kind of arrows in the quiver, so to speak, that marketers have. The first one is figuring out, how can you have sustainable and useful usage of that IDFP or that ID for vendors. And that's essentially a publisher-specific ID. Now, ultimately, Apple has made it, relatively clear that the use cases for how you should use that ID in the context of advertising are pretty limited. Not necessarily it should be used for targeting. But at least for the short term, it does seem like it will be a useful tool for frequency capping. Beyond that, I think it really kind of, it lays into a broader set of tools for, how can advertisers be drawing contextual insights? How can, what data signals do you have available to you that are privacy safe, but ultimately yield, high predictive insight for, propensity for conversion or ROAS. So beyond that, I think it's moving away from how do we have discussions on how we can target the user, get around it, but rather how can we optimize to this new IDFA-less world? And I think it's going to result in a lot of verticalization.
First thing we want to understand is, in the two markets that are represented on this call, quite strong in terms of Android representation. So what happens with Google in terms of Android and the Play Store? Is it pretty much a wait and see what happens and roll out an informed solution, or do you think they're going to follow suit? And what would the motivations be?
So I'm a big fan of looking to history for lessons. And I would say the best history that we've got in front of us is the history of the cookie and how Apple dealt with cookies in the web browser space. For those who aren't entirely familiar, a couple years ago, Apple rolled out something called ITP, or Intelligent Tracking Prevention. I won't get too into the details of that, but the important things to take away are that Apple, over about a 1.5-year period, gradually but thoroughly deprecated the third-party cookie and how it could be used for tracking. Ultimately, what we saw there is that Google was forced to play its hand and follow suit. So they were losing, market share over browser in favor of users wanting to use Safari because of the privacy tools that it provided. So Google, kind of feeling left out, did eventually announce that they were going to deprecate cookies as well. So I think, I'm not encouraging anyone to look too much into the crystal ball here. But what I would say is that, Google certainly has an investment in advertising that Apple doesn't. So, purely from a market perspective, it's kind of a no-brainer that Apple might do this because they're looking to kind of swallow up that market share. Ultimately, Google has a lot more money on the table, a little bit more at stake with their usage of advertising IDs. I would say the conservative and cautious marketer should probably expect that anywhere from 12 to 18 months, we might hear about an announcement of Google doing something similar. In the very short term, what I would expect, pending the rollout of the partial IDFA deprecation, is that the value of Android inventory will probably go up a little bit. Because Apple inventory will be less addressable, I would expect some slightly higher CPMs for targetable Android inventory, at least in the short term. Anything you'd want to add onto that, Alasdair?
I think the only thing I add is kind of how Apple approached ITP is kind of my expectation of how Apple's also going to approach SP Ad Network as well. So if there are workarounds in the ITP world, Apple's approach there was essentially to play whack-a-mole with advertisers. I expect their behavior is going to be very similar in the in-app world as well.
Fair enough. So carry on, man. Sorry, Alex, did I interrupt you there?
No, I was just going to say, absolutely. If we're going to take a lesson from history here, it was that there were a lot of very, very smart people in the web browser world who thought they could outsmart Apple. And every 3 months, Apple would release a new change that just got around it. So if there's a lesson to be learned here, it's that Apple doesn't play ball. So you got to think about the long term.
Fair enough. So come, guys, address some of the conspiracy theories. There's a lot of them floating around. What was the actual motivation? What's the motivation behind it?
I think it goes back again to core consumer values. So Apple's they build a B2C product, and they sell a product to consumers, and therefore when they're marketing to consumers, they have to make sure they're aligning with core consumer values. And increasingly over the years, we've seen with GDPR, CCPA, even earlier on with COPPA, online privacy for users is becoming more and more important to consumers. And so if Apple is trying to sell hardware to their customers, it just makes sense for them to take a privacy-centric approach. It's really that simple.
Alex, you want to build on that?
I think it hit all of the major points there. Apple doesn't have as much stake in the game in advertising as Google does. So if they're trying to get to consumers, it makes sense that they'd be the first one to step forward.
Look, you referenced CPMs a little bit earlier. So, what will happen to the KPIs tracked by advertisers? For years now, we've been moving to more specific granular stats away from raw CPM campaigns. Does this mean a shift back? If performance is measured only on a campaign level, will that increase our CPMs? What's the prediction?
To use an analogy, as opposed to kind of going to a lake in the middle of the night and trying to fish in that dark lake where you can't really see the fish and maybe getting a catch. That's where we are going. That's where we were before. And we moved to a world where essentially you could see the fish in the water, you could, take a harpoon and you could, get exactly the fish you wanted. So that's user targeting. So we're going from a harpoon world back to a fishing in the dark world when an IDFA is not available. So like you mentioned, when you're fishing in the dark, you're going to get, you're not going to be able to target the fish you're trying to look for, but you are going to get some fish. When you're targeting a broader base of users, you can't separate those users into specific line items or targeting parameters, if you will. So there's some things that advertisers can't do. So for example, let's say there's a big fish in the water. You want to pay a lot for that user, which is a very common thing in a performance advertising context. Well, if you can't see the big fish in the water, you're not going to be able to price that fish $100 CPM, which sometimes happens. What you do is that fish is treated as part of an aggregate. There could be big fish and small fish, and then when you're pricing, the pricing is representative of the population of fish in the lake, not just that one fish that you're trying to target. So, we're going from a harpoon world back to a fish world, and pricing is going to be based on averages if you can't target a specific user.
Yeah, I would, and these are predictions, right? I have no crystal ball. I would say until this point, iOS inventory that had IDFAs was considered probably some of the most premium inventory that you could buy. And in most cases, it yielded a higher price point than Android inventory. So, using some basic laws of, Econ 101, supply and demand, as we see that the percentage of inventory in iOS that has an IDFA go down, I would expect for what's left with an IDFA will probably bump up a little bit in price. What I would expect is that the IDFA-less inventory will probably go down a little bit as marketers look to shift their budget into that Android inventory, which will still be largely addressable, at least for the near future. And the consequential shift in that demand will probably cause the Android CPMs and CPIs to go up. So what I would recommend to marketers is that we've been given a beautiful gift, which is that we've been given some extra time here. So what I would recommend is that advertisers take time with their partners to start testing into this IDFA-less inventory to find, what sort of supply paths can you get efficient and effective spend on that IDFA-less inventory, because in probably about 4 or 5 months, you're going to have access to a lot more of it. And it's probably going to be relatively affordable for premium users. So the advertisers who can figure out how to effectively spend on that today are going to be very successful, 4 and 5 months from now. So that's the only part that I would add on to that.
That makes complete sense.
Something else. Go ahead. Alex. One thing that's really interesting when you look at IDFA users versus LAT users is the composition of the users who belong to those populations today. So if you are a limit ad tracking user, in order to become a limit ad tracking user, before iOS 14, you would have to go to this pretty hidden setting in your options on your phone in order to say, I do not want to be tracked, which is, basically what I take from that is if you're a user who wants to not be tracked, then you really, really do not want to be tracked because you did the research to go and find this hidden option, then you selected that hidden option. The composition of users who don't want to be tracked or do want to be tracked will be a little bit different because the UX has changed pretty significantly now that Apple's rolled out this opt-in to appear basically whenever an app opens up. So the real question is, will users, just opt in because they're lazy, for example, or will users opt out in 90% of cases? It's really difficult to predict user behavior. I think the one thing I can carry on as an assumption into the future is that when you look at the population of opt-out users, there's lower barriers to entry for opt-out than there was before. So the composition of that population of opt-out users is a lot less specific when we're talking about limit ad tracking about IDFA, ATT framework than limit ad tracking. So the KPIs may change. All this to say, when you take this time to test, I would recommend also retesting as the composition of these users kind of change over time. Just to see if the results do end up changing as well, to reflect that. It's important to kind of test and retest and review and re-review results.
I'm going to fire one more at you guys before we wrap and hand over for questions, but I really wanted to start thinking about performance, especially around utility apps. Obviously, mobile's grown in importance for many, many brands beyond just the simple advertising sphere. You've got apps that want customers to place orders, book tickets, engage in loyalty programs, etc., etc., etc. How do those brand performance campaigns change with Apple's changes?
So Apple's, within iOS 14, Apple's released some other features which we think are pretty cool, and the content of what's advertised may change as a result of these features. So one of the features we're interested in is app clips, which could be a replacement for an app in many contexts for users when they're trying to make a purchase, very simply, or the app clip itself could be a call to action within an advertisement, for example. So the app clips could be used to ease the user into the full app experience and could be injected into the advertising. As far as advertising itself is concerned, the Apple changes are mainly centered around privacy. So when we're talking about opt-ins, we want to make sure that the advertiser or the publisher, is at least giving a strong value proposition to their users on why they should opt into advertising, so that advertisers can have as many users opting with an IDFA as possible. But in the absence of that, the way that advertisers need to market needs to be centered around SKAd network and the limitations that are kind of intrinsic to that design, which include things such as you can only, for example, target a specific app in up to 100 distinguishable ways, for example. So, if you're running a global app campaign, that means you could only have up to 100 different prices for 100 different countries if you run your campaign that way. That's the main thing, is making sure that you are prepared for your mobile measurement under SKAd network.
Final thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to think about, that sort of advertising in the context of what is your outcome, right? So if you're a performance advertiser and your end outcome is trying to drive installs, then SKAd network, is going to be a premier tool moving into the future. If you're closer to the brand side of things, where you might be, looking to drive conversions lower in the funnel than just an install, long-term sustainable growth, lifetime value of customers, that sort of thing, you really need to have the conversation with the different sorts of, brand measurement providers you're having. Install-based campaigns, which are heavily impacted on the availability of an IDFA on both media interaction and click and install, will have SKAd network. But there are a whole bevy of tools out there to help provide measurement and drive high value acquisition that might not necessarily be so dependent on an IDFA. So things like viewability, things like, anti-fraud, those sorts of tools might not be so dependent on that ID. And for, advertisers that are partnering with partners that might not be so dependent on the IDFA, those are going to be increasingly important tools in providing, brand measurement and providing visibility and trust into the inventory that you're purchasing, without kind of a verifiable, addressable inventory target, so to speak. So, my kind of advice here is to think about, which of the two lanes do you kind of fall into, and then go ahead and go to your partners that are helping you buy that, helping you measure that, and kind of sit down and try to have a pretty frank conversation with them. What tools do you have in your tool belt to help me as an advertiser in this kind of brave new world, so to speak?
Fair enough. Thanks, guys. I'm looking at time now quickly, and I wanted to leave 5 available for Q&A. So, Alvin, if you don't mind, I'll hand that over to you.
Sure. Thank you, guys. That was really interesting, and we still have 100% with us, even though it's almost 7 in Istanbul and 8 in MENA region. So, okay, I want to ask a few questions from the audience. So, Nazlı from Think with Data, she's asking, is there a toolkit or some type of guidelines for marketeers to help get ready for updates related to IDFA?
So for updates related to IDFA, there are 2 things you need to watch out for. The first one is the opt-in, and the second one is SKAd network. So if you're a publisher, then you'll want to review the documentation for receiving an opt-in to make sure that you're doing that correctly. And you also want to review the WWDC keynote on how to provide information to the user before the opt-in, so you can provide a strong value proposition to that user before you ask them if they can be tracked across apps and websites. So I encourage you to review that if you're a publisher. If you're an advertiser and you're looking to do an app campaign without an IDFA, then you need to get ready for SKAd network mobile measurement. And as an advertiser, you essentially have 3 action items. The first one is when a user opens your app for the first time, you need to implement some code to initiate Apple's attribution system. It's called Register App or Ad Network Attribution. The second thing an advertiser needs to do is they need to figure out how they're going to measure their campaign with SKAd network. And so, as I mentioned, you can only structure your campaign in a way such that one specific app can be targeted up to 100 distinguishable ways. When you're setting up your BI systems, you need to be able to set it up so that you can receive the SKAd network data, which is your second action item. And your third action item is you need to figure out how to structure your campaign to work with this limitation too, this 100 campaign ID limitation. So if you do those 3 things as an advertiser, and then you're able to test those things, then you're going to be in a pretty good shape for when Apple starts enforcing IDFA on iOS 14. The app starts enforcing the app transparency tracking ATT framework, I apologize, on iOS 14.
Okay. Jonathan also mentioned that AdColony has an agency and brand and agency update. So after this webinar, we're recording this. We'll be putting it live and we'll be sharing the webinar with you guys. And I guess we can also, I didn't ask you guys this, but I guess we can also share the updates for brands and agencies in our thank you notes. Okay, so one more question. I mean, you guys already covered your thoughts about like the general impact of this iOS 14 on CPC, CPMs, but like in terms of the budgets, like when we look at the advertising budgets next year, is it gonna rise? Is it gonna fall? What's the impact going to be in the overall digital ad spend?
So AdColony has both performance advertisers and brand advertisers. And so depending on who you ask, you may get a different answer. And so when we're talking about SK Ad Network, the main advertiser that's going to use that is an app install advertiser who's doing some sort of performance campaign. And to answer the question for them, most likely their budgets are dependent on the quality of the users that they acquire into their apps when they're doing advertising. So their budgets are based on the quality. Now, if it's more difficult to find high quality users as a result of not being able to target them, then the quality of those campaigns goes down. So that's a possibility, but then also those users could appear within the population of other users in that kind of fish scenario I talked about, and you still could end up getting those users through your campaigns. It's really hard to know at this point. That's why we encourage advertisers to test, especially if they're performance advertisers. Test with SK Ad Network, see what your results look like, experiment with new contextual features, and see if your campaigns still yield the same results, in which case your budgets would be the same or they could get better. But the main thing is to test. If you're a brand advertiser, it's a little more unclear. It really depends on what the requirements are for brand campaigns to run an inventory. What we do know is that brands set some pretty strict requirements on campaigns already. So they're looking for things like, am I reaching the right target demographic, or were my campaigns viewable, or is my supply brand safe? And so some of those things will not require an IDFA. So for example, doing viewability measurement at an app level is still going to be fine, but some things are going to be impacted in some way. So doing audience targeting, and so it's difficult to say if budgets are going to increase or decrease at this point, because what's essentially changing is our way of measuring the acceptance criteria of advertisers. I don't think the acceptance criteria for advertisers is going to change though. And so essentially what that means is that advertisers, I think, are going to have very similar requirements, but a different way of measuring them, and we have to figure out what that is. And only then will we figure out if budgets are going to be higher or lower. It's going to be difficult for us to kind of speak in the same language as we currently do with our advertisers. A smaller percentage of users are measurable though. And so as a result of that, I think what's going to happen, I can't say the budgets are going to change, but at least the conversations, I think, are going to change.
Okay. Alex, do you have any last minute comments before we close the webinar?
Yeah, real quick. I'm kind of a glass half full kind of guy. I think ultimately what this represents is disruption. It's a change to the playing field, right? And before now, things in mobile advertising, I wouldn't say they were stagnant because they were growing crazy, but everybody had the same set of tools. And now we're being handed a change. And I think, advertisers that handle that change well could certainly see substantial budget growth, right? Because advertisers, in a way, are competing against each other. They're competing against each other to see who can make the most use out of the inventory, who can provide the most valuable advertising. And now, because everything's changing, the advertisers who are intelligent, the advertisers who use that change well to their benefit, I think could see really substantial increases to efficiency. So, overall, kind of hard to make the judgment on, will budgets go up, will budgets go down? But there will be winners and there will be losers. And I think those who play it well, this could be a very good thing.
Warrick, would you like to add anything, or shall we close?
All good. Good to close. Thanks, Alvin.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I mean, it's almost an hour, and we had a very good participation. And thank you, Alasdair. I know it's really early for you guys. Thank you, Warwick, for putting everything together with your team. So thank you, everyone.